For those older gamers that actually did end up playing System Shock, I gotta tell you that despite the fact that I'm also a dinosaur or even a fossil at this point, I never ended up playing the original System Shock. But for everybody else, System Shock basically created the genre of video game that is responsible for Deus Ex, BioShock, and even Dishonored. These games would not exist without System Shock. Now, before we get into the review today, I do want to mention that back when I was a lot younger, I do remember that I really enjoyed these first-person dungeon crawlers. These games usually were overly complex, required a lot of inventory management, but I would just go into the dungeon as deep as I could, kill everything, get all of the loot, and put it into my treasure vault. I don't think I ever ended up beating any of these games. It was just something that I casually enjoyed. Now, on top of that, I also am much more inclined to play a game with a medieval theme. System Shock, however, is a futuristic theme where you're fighting mechs and cyborgs and stuff like that, which wasn't really my thing and still isn't really 100% my thing nowadays. Like, I almost always would prefer to have a sword in a video game versus a gun, which is why I make a 100% melee build in a game like Warframe, because I refuse to play the game the way that the developers want me to. With all of that said, I took a risk getting the System Shock remake. And in fact, the main reason that I did purchase this is because I'm a fan of Night Dive Studios. To give a little bit of a history lesson to you guys, the reason why I started doing YouTube in the first place was because I wanted an excuse to play one of my childhood favorite games, Turok 2. At the time that I started my channel, the Turok franchise was kind of in limbo. Disney ended up owning it at some point because Acclaim, the original company that created the game, went out of business. Eventually, Night Dive Studios would end up purchasing the rights to the Turok franchise and would slowly end up porting those games to modern hardware, PCs, and consoles. Fun fact, Acclaim, the company that originally made Turok, did go bankrupt, but a lot of the original developers ended up making a new studio called Retro Studios, which is responsible for the Metroid Prime games. But anyways, Night Dive Studios basically takes these old games and ports them to modern hardware, but for a few years, they actually started working on their first original title, which was the System Shock remake. For a quick comparison, this is what the old System Shock looked like, and this is what it looks like now. This is truly 100% the developers building this game from the ground up. And unfortunately, I can't really give my own opinion of comparison between the original and the remake because, again, I never played the original. But god damn it, if this game isn't incredible. Like, if this was what the original System Shock game was, this is better than most modern games. Let's start at the beginning. When you're starting a new file, you have all of these options for difficulty setting. These will significantly change the game. It's not like Skyrim where enemies just get an inflated health bar. If you choose harder enemies, you're gonna be fighting harder enemies in areas that you wouldn't normally fight them. Mission difficulty will also significantly make the game easier or harder depending on the scaling. Like, I saw some dude on the forum asking like, okay, how can I end up getting into the reactor core to turn off the reactor? And upon investigation, people were telling him like, bro, you don't need to go into the reactor core because you chose the easy story mode difficulty. Like, it just, how does a game that is this old have so much more nuance to the gameplay based on difficulties? Don't go on mission 3. Don't do it. Not if it's your first time going through the game. If you go to mission 3 difficulty, you have a 10-hour time limit to beat the entire game. And this campaign took me 20 hours to beat. But okay, let's talk about what the game actually is. It's essentially a dungeon crawler. Now you understand why I talked about them earlier in the video. From the word go, you are going to be completely in control of the entire adventure, and it is going to end up being one hell of a confusing time. Your main objective is unclear, and most of the objectives that you have to complete are actually just going to be discovered organically by yourself if you end up reading through some of the dialogue, emails, or optional audio logs. A thing that you'll see in modern video games is you might come across a door that requires a key code, and what usually ends up happening in modern games is you'll look around in that very same room and you'll end up finding the security code. In System Shock, you could end up finding the security code 5 levels later to a doorway that you could access in the first level. Because, spoiler, this entire game is seamless without any loading screens. The levels are so intricate and detailed that the map does no justice to it. The funny thing is that While the map does kind of suck for navigation, the immersion in this game is insane because the map itself is literally schematics of the ship, which explains why it's so hard to navigate a 3D space from a top-down perspective. Now, I will say that aside from me gushing about this game, there are definitely some problems because of the fact that it's so old school. There isn't a quest tracker, and there's a lot of things that you're gonna either have to write down on a physical notepad or a text document, or try to keep them in your head. When I was about halfway through this game, I realized that if I stopped playing for a couple days, I would be completely lost and not have any idea where to go. This also means that you could very easily accidentally end up missing a key item and then spend hours and hours searching around the map until you end up finding this tiny little crawl space that has an ID card that you needed the entire time. I'll say this. If you end up playing this game and you come across some sort of a doorway or something that you generally find confusing, just mark it on your map and save it for later, because more than likely it's going to be something you'll be able to interact with further down the line. The maintenance level alone has like 50 locked doors, but that's because it's actually utilized in the end game. God, I'm just talking about the level design. I haven't even talked about the gameplay. At its core, it's going to end up being a first-person shooter, but it's kind of a survival horror game because similar to Resident Evil, you're gonna have very, very limited amounts of ammo and resources that you have to manage while trying to deal with the various enemies. Like on top of the limited resources you can find, you also have a pretty cramped inventory space that you can upgrade, but the upgrades for it are very, very hard to come by and can be easily missed. And then you have a very, very small bank or storage system that is going to end up being shared across all of the levels. But the cool thing about this game is that because nothing's really random generated per se, you could actually just leave a gun on the ground or an item that's clogging up your inventory, and you could just mark it and come back to it later. There's a lot of things that are also optional in the game because there's like a bunch of guns that you might not necessarily want to even bother using just because you're more comfortable with another weapon. Way late in the game, for example, I ended up finding a grenade launcher, but the amount of inventory space that it took versus just equipping and throwing the grenades just wasn't worth it for me, so I left that thing behind. In a way, I guess this kind of adds replay value because now I know that's where the grenade launcher is, so if I want to end up utilizing it next time through, I could just grab it right away. My only legitimate issue with this game is because it's so old and the first of its kind, it doesn't really have any options for dealing with enemies other than direct confrontation. There's no way that you can end up hacking them or turning them off or powering them down or anything. True, you could end up EMPing an enemy and running past them, but it just delays a problem you're gonna have to deal with later anyway. That said, I did see a lot of people complaining about the limited amount of ammo and resources. Now, I generally speaking am really good at these types of games. If you look at my Resident Evil playthroughs, I usually have an overabundance of resources by the time I end up getting to the end of the game, and System Shock was no exception. Maybe at the halfway point, I realized that I was getting really, really low on ammo for my shotgun, and then I realized I had like 200 bullets for my pistol, and suddenly I was like, oh, I'm fine. The other thing too is that even if you're an absolute idiot and you miss every single one of your shots and you lose all of your ammo just by shooting a wall just for fun, there is going to end up being energy recharge stations which will power up your electric gun, which technically is an infinite ammo gun. And there are going to end up being some healing stations if you run out of healing items. While ammo wasn't much of a problem for me, healing items was very difficult for me to manage, but there are going to end up being various vending machines and so on and so forth that you can end up getting either more health or ammo from. The way that you end up getting currency in this game is you can basically pick up every item in the game and you can vaporize it for scrap, and every 10 scrap that you put into a recycler is going to equal 1 credit. Do you end up getting ammo? Do you end up getting health? Or do you end up getting an upgrade to your gun so that you save more ammo in the long run? The story also doesn't really take much of a back seat in this game, but is entirely optional. I always appreciate when a game isn't all up in your face about how good the story is, and god damn, this story is so good. Like, let me tell you, I am not a big fan of audio logs. I listen to every single one of them in System Shock because they're expertly recorded with expert sound design. Especially SHODAN, the final boss of the game, which is basically this unhinged AI. She's taken over the entire station, and her voice dialogue is just so like impressive to me in terms of the sound design.
He has released relinquished the last of the station's encrypted files and defenses. His cynical contempt for mankind pleases me.
But again, all of this is optional. There's only going to end up being a handful of moments where you'll have a direct conversation with either human characters or SHODAN herself. I mean, obviously your character doesn't talk back because you're the silent protagonist, but so what do I rate this game? Well, as no surprise, 5 out of 5. Masterclass. This is a game that I didn't know that I would love this much, but I'm so glad that I took the risk of purchasing it strictly because of Night Dive Studios, because they did a phenomenal job. This game is amazing. I do think that there is a lot of things about this game that a modern gamer might not like or appreciate. I'm not in any way trying to be like, oh, grandpa's way of gaming was better, because there definitely could benefit to being a quest tracker or something that would end up marking locked doors. At the beginning of the game, I really struggled with trying to figure out where to go as the levels started to open up a lot more. But eventually I started to get into the habit of just marking anything that I was unsure of so that I would know to come back there later, and it hasn't led me astray since. Keep in mind, the gunplay isn't as fast paced as like Doom Eternal. It's actually more slow and methodical. And this game can also be quite stressful with the amount of stuff that you're trying to micromanage because of the lack of a quest system. But if that doesn't sound appealing to you, let's not forget that you can always crank down the difficulty so that you can get all of the game and none of the headache.